the redcoats, the British regular troops. Warning shots and bells were heard all along the way. Militiamen turned out everywhere. So these Minutemen, they did their job. They got out on a moment's notice. Can you imagine, Scott, being one of those British soldiers? You get on the boat, you go across the Charles River, you reassemble on the mainland, and you start marching toward Lexington, and all of a sudden you start hearing shots going off in the woods, and off in the distance you hear bells ringing, and they must have been thinking, "Oh crap! This is supposed to be secret. Our coming was not supposed to be heralded by the ringing of bells and the firing of muskets." But that's exactly what happened. So by the time they get to Lexington, nobody's going to be surprised.
Yeah, so our little reconnaissance team can work. One interesting thing about Paul Revere and William Dawes is if it were just William Dawes trying to deliver the message, it very well could have happened that the Minutemen wouldn't have been roused to action. And you were mentioning, James, that we all know Paul Revere, but no one knows William Dawes. Part of the reason is that he's mentioned in almost no historical sources at all, but Paul Revere is. And why is that? I learned about this not from a history book, but Pop Psychology, Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point, where he gets into network theory, and this is something that historians use, where it's been found, usually there are types of people called connectors, meaning that your average person might only have maybe a few dozen or a few hundred relations, and it averages out to about 200 per person. But then there are always people on the barbell curve at the extreme end who might know thousands of people and be the central node. And if you want to get a message out to a community, talk to that person because he knows so many people that he will trigger it. Well, Paul Revere was that. I mentioned earlier he's actively engaged in colonial life. He knew hundreds of people. And it meant that when he rode into a town, he knew exactly what house to go to, who had influence. If you ride by a certain house and shout that not the British, what's the term you use, James?
The regulars.
Regulars, thank you. The regulars are coming. He would know this man is the local dignitary, the tanner that everyone knows, whatever. And then the word would get around to the town and the village. William Dawes was not well connected. I think I would be much more of a Dawes than a Paul Revere. So he would just knock on a door at random, and it might be some sleepy farmer, and he thinks, well, I don't know you, and shut the door. So Dawes rode 17 miles, and some historians even wondered if he didn't speak to a single person on the way, because he's rarely in the records, but that's because he didn't have the social gravity or the social currency that Paul Revere did. So that's why almost no one remembers him that night. I don't know if James were trying to do revisionist history and recover William Dawes or not, or say, be a go-getter if you want to get in the historical record, but there you go. That's the story.
Yeah, there's also the famous poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Paul Revere's Ride, which some of us that are older probably read that in grade school or something. And it starts out, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year," and so on and so on. So it immortalizes Paul Revere, and there's no mention of Dawes at all. I guess it wouldn't rhyme very well, right, Scott?
Revere and Dawes, they were like eagles with sharp claws. Yes.
Yeah, I know. It's like I just can't fit that into the poem. It doesn't fit the rhyming scheme and the meter. So sorry, Dawes, you're out of here. All right, let's move on, shall we?
Yes.
So let's march along with the British. Picture yourself as one of these British soldiers. You think well, I mean, some of them didn't even really know what they were doing, where they were going, but you're going through the dark, and then you start hearing all these shots fired off, and you hear people shouting, and you hear church bells going off, and you realize, maybe this isn't going to be quite as easy as we thought it would. So they marched toward Lexington. They reached the outskirts of the town around 4:30 a.m. So they'd been marching through the night, several hours. You know, these British troops are very sleepy. They're yawning. And if it's like me, man, I would be just about to fall asleep right there on the spot. An advance unit of the British force arrived at the town's common area, which is now called Lexington Green. And you can actually go there and see that very green today. I was there back in 2011. It was really neat. And in Lexington Green, the British encountered about 60 to 70 armed militiamen. Nobody really knows exactly how many there were. There had been more, but some of them had gone home. And here are these militiamen, these Americans. So remember, if you're a British soldier, you're part of the best army in the world, or at least one of the best armies in the world. And these are a bunch of farmers with guns. That's what I call militia, farmers with guns. They're not all 100% farmers, but most of them would have been. But of course, they knew how to shoot. They weren't bad shots. Just because we call them farmers with guns, that doesn't mean they were incompetent. They certainly didn't have the discipline that the British soldiers had. So there they are, 60 or 70, give or take a few, were standing there waiting on them. And the militia were led by Captain John Parker. And I'm gonna take an excursus here, Scott. I'm gonna take a side note. So let's push pause on the military narrative. And I want to talk about quotations. You know, you read enough books and you'll see these famous quotations that a lot of us already know. Things like "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." And Scott, you've done a lot of historical research. I've done quite a bit myself. And so you know this, Scott, that you'll read one book and it'll say, "Oh, there's no way that person actually said that. That's just got to be apocryphal, or it's got to be a made up story. They wouldn't have said that." And then you'll read another scholar who will say, "Oh yeah, they definitely said it." And then you'll read a third scholar who will say, "Well, they might have said it. We really don't know." So I'm going to err on the side of credulity. I'm going to say that these guys said these things, and maybe they didn't. Maybe I don't know, Scott, maybe I'll use the phrase "he is said to have."
Well, okay,
shouted.
you know, we've made that caveat emptor, or caveat whatever Latin is for listener. I don't know. I think we could just say without qualification, most of the background would be behind us, but you are right. Some of them just seem too perfect. And
yeah, you know, and some of them, it was, you first see the quote in a source written 100 years later or something. But you know what, Scott? I like the quotes, and they should have been said. If they weren't said, they should have said it.
Let's do it.
We're gonna lay out most of these famous quotes for you folks, and don't send us an angry email or comment saying, "Well, they didn't really say that. You got to know better than that. You guys call yourselves scholars." We realize that there is a degree of skepticism with a lot of these quotes, but we like them, and so we're going to throw them out anyway. They make the story a lot more colorful and fun. All right, so there, I'm getting off my soapbox now. So let's go back. So again, the militia, the British Army. It's not the full army, of course. It's a group of about 700-800 people. They are marching toward Lexington. They encounter 60 to 70 armed militiamen. They have them outnumbered 10-1. And the militia's leader, Captain John Parker, supposedly shouted to his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they want to have a war, let it begin here." Major Pitcairn, in turn, he supposedly said, "Throw down your arms, you rebels. Disperse, damn you, disperse." And the Minutemen, some of them thought that was a pretty good idea. Guys, there's 10 of them for every one of us, and they're professionals. So some of the Minutemen actually did turn to leave, but they kept their arms. And again, Pitcairn supposedly shouted, "Damn you, why don't you lay down your arms?" Another officer shouted, "Damn them, we will have them." So a lot of damning and condemning. But finally, the war of words turns into a shooting match. One of the British soldiers fired without orders, or he had an accidental discharge. It's kind of like the Boston Massacre. We don't really know what happened, why they fired, or whether it was intentional or not. But we know that this was not ordered. The British commander, Smith, or Pitcairn, neither one of them ordered that the British troops fire upon the Minutemen. But somebody did, and pretty soon all the British opened fire, and they killed 8 and they wounded 10. The remaining rebels scattered. No British were killed, and only 1 was wounded. Colonel Smith then arrived, reformed the troops, and marched them to Concord. And as they marched, again, they heard alarm guns going off to summon more militiamen.
Well, we don't know about the quotes of some of these people, but we do know a John Adams one. I think you have on Lexington.
Yeah. So before I give you the Adams quote, and Adams said a lot of things, and he wrote a lot of things. Adams has one of the most voluminous correspondences ever. Thank goodness, and they didn't burn them like some of the people did. Like that, Martha Washington burned almost all of her letters back and forth with George, which historians are not happy about today. Yeah. But anyway, so before I give the John Adams quote, I just want to sum up by saying this is the Battle of Lexington. And again, it's not much of a battle. It's just 800 versus perhaps 70. So that's a very, very small battle, even by Revolutionary War standards. It's really just more of a skirmish, Scott, or a firefight. I don't know. It's just one exchange of fire. 8 are killed, 10 are wounded, and that's it. But it's important symbolically because this is the first time you had a sizable or major exchange of fire between British and colonial military units. And this makes it very, very difficult for there to be peace, for it to be any reconciliation. It's not impossible at this point. Again, it's a minor occasion, but still, this woke up the British and it woke up the world in a way that it's often called the shot heard round the world. It's considered the first battle of the American Revolution, even though it's very, very small. And here's what John Adams said. He said, the Battle of Lexington on the 19th of April changed the instruments of warfare from the pen to the sword. So that's very, very concise and pithy way of putting it, I thought.
Well, just a little fact before we get on to the March at Concord. I read somewhere that there were still people hoping that warfare wouldn't break out. And there were even those in Great Britain who raised money for the widows of Americans killed in Lexington and Concord. There you go. There was a lot of, there was a significant amount of pro-American or pro-colonial sentiment in Great Britain. Obviously, it's a minority, but it is significant. Mm-hmm. All right, so moving on to Concord, the British force just, as we've seen, they fire on the Americans or the Patriots or the Minutemen, whatever you want to call them. There's a lot of ways to refer to them, and basically sweep them aside. And they continue on to the next town, which is Concord. They reach Concord by daybreak. Okay, so it's about 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and the militia there realize they're outnumbered, so they retreat northward. There was a river or creek, really, and there was a bridge. There's several bridges, but this one particular bridge called the North Bridge, which is going to have a major part in the drama, if you will. They go across the North Bridge to higher ground, and they wait. Colonel Smith sends 7 companies of light infantry through the town, and then across the bridge. If you think the town is, imagine a computer screen or as a map, the town is kind of at the bottom middle of the screen, and then the river or the creek is right above it, and then the bridge is there. So the British sweep through the town, they go across the bridge, which spans the Concord River, and they form a protective line to keep the militia people or the Minutemen back. And while they're doing this, the Grenadiers search the local houses for the military supplies. Remember, the whole point of going to Concord was to find the gunpowder and the weapons and the ammo that the Americans were supposedly storing there. All they found were 3 wooden cannon. Okay, wooden cannon. So this is not exactly a state-of-the-art arsenal here. So they burned the cannon, and they also burned the town's Liberty Pole. Liberty Pole was just a pole that the colonists put up kind of as a symbol of their liberty and their freedom, their rights, which the British were trampling upon, they felt. Another 2 companies of regulars searched a farmhouse west of town, but they found nothing. So they just can't find all this ammo that was supposed to be there. Meanwhile, several companies of militiamen, a total of about 500 men, gathered on Punkatasset Hill. And again, this is north of where the British are. They're commanded by a man named Colonel James Barrett. The British just didn't pay a lot of attention to them. Again, they're searching. They're looking for these supplies, this military gear. The militiamen marched to a ridge 300 feet west of the North Bridge, and they deployed them in battle formation. So the militias decide they're going to go on the offensive now. They've been kind of watching and waiting. One of the lieutenants of the militiamen, a man named Joseph Hosmer, he saw the smoke from the burning artillery pieces, and he thought it was coming from burning buildings in the town. So he sees this smoke, and he thinks, uh-oh, they're burning our town down. And he said, supposedly, should I throw in that disclaimer every time, Scott? If we forget,
Yeah, if we forget, listener, then just remember we're not